Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Huntington's disease and Huntington's disease medications. Okay, right, so we're in the process of discussing how it is that the motor symptoms of Huntington's disease arise, i.e. which portions of the brain are going to degenerate in Huntington's disease particularly badly, which will lead to the motor symptoms. First the chorea, and then it will swing in the opposite direction and cause the hypokinesia. Okay, now to understand this, we need to have a very decent understanding of how the basal ganglia work. Okay, because it's going to be the dorsal striatum, which is a key part of the basal ganglia, that is going to degenerate hugely in Huntington's disease, and this is going to be responsible for the motor symptoms of the disease. Okay, right, so we're currently in the process of discussing the function now of the basal ganglia. We've discussed the neuroanatomy, now we're going to see the function. Okay, now we've done this broad overview of what the basal ganglia do, which is that they give this permissive signal to motor plans in the secondary motor cortex. Now, we are going to look at this pathway backwards, basically. So to look at this pathway in more detail, we're going to start backwards, basically. We're not going to start with the permissive signal, we're not going to start with the signal going from the secondary motor cortex to the basal ganglia. We're going to start with the signal going from the basal ganglia back to the secondary motor cortex. However, it doesn't actually come from the basal ganglia, it comes from the thalami, okay, but the thalami are going to be part of this loop, okay, so the loop is often called, in full, the cortico, because it's going to start from the cortex, then it's going to go to the basal ganglia, so the cortico-basal ganglia, okay, and then finally thalamocortical, okay, because then it's going to go on to the thalamus, which is then going to send it back to the cortex pathway, okay, and some people will put in the word motor then to highlight that it's a motor pathway. So the cortico-basal ganglia thalamocortical motor pathway, that's what we're about to study. That's this pathway by which the cortex asks for permission from the basal ganglia then through the thalamocortical pathway gives permission to the secondary motor cortex for the motor plan to be sent onwards to the primary motor cortex where it will actually be initiated. Okay, right. So we now want to discuss this thalamocortical projection, so the projection from the thalamus that's going to go back to the secondary motor cortex and will give permission, okay? So that's where we're going to start. So for this, we're going to have to look at the structure of the thalami in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm going to draw the left thalamus out now in more detail. So we're going to take this left thalamus here, and now I'm going to draw it in more detail, okay, because we're going to need to know two of the thalamic nuclei. Now I'm not going to go through all of the thalamic nuclei because there's a huge number of thalamic nuclei. I'm just going to show you the two that we need. Okay, so the thalami are divided up quite usefully anatomically, okay, they have a structure through them known as the internal medullary lamina. So I'll draw the thalami firstly. Okay, so here is the left thalamus, and now within the left thalamus you're going to have this structure here, which is known as the internal medullary lamina. Okay, so this is the left thalamus. I think I'll just show the right thalamus as well to show how they're going to be bilaterally symmetric. So here's the right thalamus now, and in this case, again, the internal medullary lamina will loop off like this to the medial aspect, basically. So this is what's known as the internal medullary lamina here. Okay, so this is the front of the thalamus, of the thalami rather, and this is the back of the thalami. Okay, so this is called the internal medullary lamina, and I think I'll now colour the internal medullary lamina in blue for both of these thalami here. Okay, now we are going to show this cortico-basal ganglia thalamocortical pathway on the left-hand side. Okay, so we're going to need the left-hand thalamus, but the exact same thing will be happening on the right-hand side as well, so it will be completely bilaterally symmetric. So we're now going to focus on this left thalamus here. Okay, now the only two nuclei that I want to show are one that sits here and the other that sits just behind this. Okay, and on the right hand side they'd be here and here. Okay, but as I say, we're going to abandon the right hand side. We're going to show this entire pathway on the left hand side. Okay, so what are these two nuclei called? So this first one here, which is now coloured in vivid purple, this is known as the ventro-anterior thalamic nucleus. Okay, or just the ventro-anterior nucleus of the thalamus. And for short, the ventro-anterior nucleus is often abbreviated as the VA nucleus. V for ventro, and then A for anterior. Okay, right. Then, behind the ventro-anterior thalamic nucleus, you've got this nucleus in turquoise here. Okay, and the nucleus in turquoise is what's known as the ventrolateral thalamic nucleus. Okay, and again, for short, ventrolateral is often abbreviated to VL, V for ventro, L for lateral. So this is the VL thalamic nucleus. Okay, in turquoise there. These are the two thalamic nuclei that are going to be involved in this cortico-basal ganglia thalamocortical motor pathway. Okay, these thalamic nuclei are going to contain excitatory fibers. Okay, so they're going to be using glutamate as their neurotransmitter, which are going to project up from the thalami into the secondary motor cortex. So on the left-hand side, these two nuclei on the left thalamus will be projecting up to the left-hand side motor cortex. Okay, and you'll have fibers that are going all over the secondary motor cortex on the left-hand side. So let me now draw this all together in another picture on this side. Okay, so let's draw this permissive pathway then. Okay, so once again I'll draw the left cerebral hemisphere viewed from the left-hand side here. Okay, and then let's mark on the important pieces of cerebral cortex. Okay, so here in red, here is our primary motor cortex. Here in green, here is our supplementary motor area. Here in blue is our premotor cortex, and here in turquoise is our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, there. So what will happen is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex will send the instruction to make a motor plan, and let's say it's this portion of the secondary motor cortex which is going to construct the motor plan that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has actually ordered. Okay, right. Now, let's now put the permissive pathway on this picture. Okay, so I'll put the thalamus here. Now, really, of course, the thalamus should be deep in there. Okay, but I'm not going to even attempt to draw it like that. So instead I'm going to have the left-hand thalamus shown here. Okay, so drawing now the internal medullary lamina, like so. Okay, and I'll colour that in blue again. Okay, and then let's mark on these two important thalamic nuclei that we've just seen, which are the ventro-anterior thalamic nucleus and also the ventrolateral thalamic nucleus. So here's the ventro-anterior, here's the ventrolateral. Okay, now these areas are going to contain excitatory neurons, okay, here, which are then going to go up to the secondary motor cortex, and give them this permissive signal. Okay, so throughout these two nuclei you are going to have excitatory neurons which are going to be going to all areas of the secondary motor cortex. So different areas of these nuclei will be going to different areas of secondary motor cortex. Let's say that this area here is the portion that actually innervates this portion of secondary motor cortex that actually has the motor plan which we want to give permission to. Okay, so I'll colour this in vivid purple here. Okay, and of course there won't just be one neuron giving permission to this entire area of secondary motor cortex. There's going to be a huge number of neurons in these two nuclei here. Okay, so I'll just mark them on. They are the ventro-anterior and the ventrolateral nucleus. Okay, so there's a huge number of glutamatergic neurons in these two nuclei which are going to be innervating the entire secondary motor cortex. Okay, and they have the capacity to give permission. Okay, so these are the permissive signals. They give permission to that area of secondary motor cortex to actually send its motor plan on to the primary motor cortex. Okay, so what we have to ask now is if you have this permissive signal coming from the ventral anterior and ventrolateral nuclei, and this is going to all portions of the secondary motor cortex, then how come you're not initiating all of the motor plans all of the time? Well, the reason is that these nuclei are not usually on. Instead, they are inhibited, they're kept off. Okay, now which portions of the basal ganglia keep these nuclei off? So now we're going to see the components of the basal ganglia. So these are the thalamic nuclei. They are not part of the basal ganglia, even though they are involved in this cortico-basal ganglia thalamocortical pathway. Okay, but now we're going to see the role of the basal ganglia structures. So I'm going to draw the two things we're going to need on here. Okay. Whoops, this is a very eccentric looking midbrain, but never mind. We've got the lenticular nucleus here, we've got the putamen here. Now the putamen, in all of these pictures that I'm going to draw from now on, the putamen is going to represent not just the putamen, but it's also going to represent the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus and the putamen do the same thing as far as the basal ganglia are concerned. Okay, so the putamen in this picture will be representing the dorsal striatum. So it's not just representing the putamen, it's representing the the caudate nucleus as well. Okay, so overall we'll call this the dorsal striatum. Okay, right. It's just because I don't want to have to draw the caudate nucleus on this picture because it will make it look far too complicated. Okay, right. Then we've got the external globus pallidus there in red and the internal globus pallidus here in blue. Okay, the other structure that's going to be now extremely important to us is the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Okay, and we're only going to need the left-hand one. We're not going to need the right-hand one. That will be doing the same thing in the right-hand circuit. Okay, so these two nuclei are now going to be very important. The substantia nigra pars reticulata here in red and the internal globus pallidus. These are the next bits that we want to look at. So here's the internal globus pallidus. Here is the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Basically, the internal globus pallidus and the substantia nigra pars reticulata do the same thing. In fact, you can think of them as anatomically distinct parts of the same thing, basically. They're the same. You can think of them as the same thing, except for the fact that they're anatomically separated. Okay, so they're going to now do the same thing. Now, what is this thing that they're going to do? Well, basically, they send in inhibitory neurons. Okay, they both contain inhibitory neurons, so neurons which are going to be releasing GABA. And they're going to send these inhibitory neurons into these thalamic nuclei, the ventral anterior and the ventrolateral thalamic nuclei. Now, I'm going to show on this picture inhibitory neurons in turquoise. Okay, so these are inhibitory neurons here, GABAergic neurons. Okay, so the internal globus pallidus and the substantia nigra pars reticulata then contain a huge number of these inhibitory neurons, and they're all going to be moving into the ventral anterior and the ventrolateral thalamic nuclei, inhibiting all of the neurons in these two nuclei and stopping them from normally firing, and therefore you no longer are delivering the permissive signal to these portions of secondary motor cortex. So they are turning the permissive signal off, basically. They keep the permissive signal off and thereby stop motor plans from going from the secondary motor cortex to the primary motor cortex. Okay, so that's usually how you keep the permissive signal off, okay? Now, what we're now going to do is work our way from the front. We're going to see how then, if this piece of cerebral cortex within the secondary motor cortex has a motor plan that actually needs to be initiated, how does it send signals down to the basal ganglia that tell the basal ganglia to stop inhibiting the certain portion of the ventral anterior and ventrolateral thalamic nuclei which innervates this certain portion of the secondary motor cortex. And note, you don't just want to turn the entire ventral anterior and ventrolateral thalamic nuclei on. You only want to turn on a little portion of those nuclei, which is the portion that gives permission to this little portion of secondary motor cortex, which has the motor plan which needs to be initiated. Okay, right, so that's what we're going to look at now. How do you give permission to this particular portion of secondary motor cortex? How do you turn off the inhibition to that particular portion of the ventroanterior or ventrolateral thalamic nuclei, which gives permission to this particular portion of secondary motor cortex. Well, this is going to be what's known as the direct pathway. Okay, right, and I'm going to show this on a new picture. Okay, so bear with me whilst I draw out these structures again. Okay, so, well, obviously I won't just draw everything out initially, I'll work through it as we go. So we'll start off by drawing out our left cerebral hemisphere again. So here it is. Here is the central sulcus once again. Okay, and then we'll put on the essential portions of the motor system. So here is the primary motor cortex. Here is the supplementary motor area, part of the secondary motor cortex. Here is the premotor cortex, part of the secondary motor cortex. And then we've got our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex here in turquoise. Okay, right. So now what's going to happen is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to come up with the idea, okay, for this movement. It's going to tell the secondary motor cortex come up with the motor plan. And now, if we actually want this motor plan to go on to the primary motor cortex, we need this permissive signal from the thalamocortical projections. Okay, I should have just said that. These projections, these permissive signals, these are known as thalamocortical projections because they come from the thalamus to the cortex. Okay, so we need to turn on these permissive thalamocortical projections, basically. Okay, right. So, what's going to happen now is this portion of secondary motor cortex is going to send down many axons into the dorsal striatum. So let me now put the lenticular nucleus here. So they're going to be going into the caudate and the putamen, although we're only showing the putamen on this diagram, but it represents the caudate and the putamen. Okay, so many excitatory neurons are going to be coming down into the dorsal striatum like so and releasing glutamate into a certain area of the dorsal striatum. Note, each portion of the secondary motor cortex will have a different portion of the dorsal striatum that corresponds to it. So this little portion of the secondary motor cortex here, where this motor plan is, will have a certain portion of the dorsal striatum where the axons from this portion are going to come into. And again, although I'm only drawing one axon, in reality there'll be a huge great number of these coming down into this same area of dorsal striatum. Okay, right. Now, let me highlight the dorsal striatum then in orange here. So here is the putamen representing the dorsal striatum. So here's the dorsal striatum. Now, in that specific portion of the dorsal striatum where these excitatory neurons have come in, they're going to be exciting neurons of the direct pathway. They're also going to be exciting neurons of the indirect pathway, but we'll come on to those later. Okay, so in this area there are going to be two types of neurons. We're at the moment going to focus on the direct pathway neurons. Okay, so you're going to be exciting many of these direct pathway neurons. Okay, now what are these direct pathway neurons going to do? Well, some of them are going to send projections into the internal globus pallidus. Others are going to send projections into the substantia nigra pars reticulata. But before I can show that, I better actually draw the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Okay, so here's our midbrain again, like so. Here is our left substantia nigra. Here is the substantia nigra pars reticulata here in red. Okay, right. So in the direct pathway, we're not actually going to need the external globus pallidus, so I'm not going to even bother colouring that in. Okay, so here come these neurons from the dorsal striatum into the internal globus pallidus and also the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Now, what are these neurons going to do? Well, they're going to be inhibitory neurons. They're going to be GABAergic. They're going to be releasing GABA. Okay, so what are they now going to do? They are going to go into particular portions of the internal globus pallidus and particular portions of the substantia nigra pars compacta, and they are going to inhibit them. And these particular portions of the internal globus pallidus and substantia nigra pars reticulata that are going to get inhibited are going to be the portions that are inhibiting the particular portion of the ventral anterior or ventrolateral thalamic nuclei, which would give permission to this particular area of the secondary motor cortex. Okay, so let's draw this all on. Okay, so here is our left thalamus, shown here. Here is the internal medullary lamina. Okay, like so. And then we'll put on the ventral anterior and the ventrolateral thalamic nuclei. So, you have now sent these inhibitory GABAergic neurons into certain portions of the internal globus pallidus and certain portions of the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Only little bits though, not the whole thing. Okay, and now these portions of the internal globus pallidus and substantia nigra pars reticulata that have been inhibited are no longer going to be sending inhibitory input into the ventral anterior and ventrolateral thalamic nuclei. Okay, so you're going to inhibit the inhibitors, basically. These neurons are no longer going to be working, basically. They're going to stop releasing GABA. Okay, and that means that this particular portion of the ventral anterior and ventrolateral thalamic nuclei, okay, which was innervated by these inhibitory neurons, is no longer going to be inhibited. Okay, and therefore it's going to turn on. Okay, and it's going to start sending excitatory input up to the cortex. Now, which portion of the cortex is it going to end up activating? Well, of course, it's going to be the bit where the motor plan is, the bit that initially sent the signal. Okay, so basically it's going to send a signal that's going to lead to the permissive signal being sent back to it, basically. But it's not going to, send a signal that's going to lead to permissive signals going elsewhere. Okay, so understand that specific bits of each of these structures are acting at each time, okay, so that you're only sending the permissive signal to that particular portion of secondary motor cortex where the motor plan actually is that needs to be initiated. Okay, right, and that will then cause this motor plan to move from the secondary motor cortex to the primary motor cortex, where it will actually be relayed down to the spinal cord and it will be initiated. Okay, right, so that's the direct pathway. That is the way that this portion of secondary motor cortex signals for the basal ganglia and thalamocortical projections to give it permission, basically, to move its motor plan onto the primary motor cortex and then hence initiate this actual movement that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex ordered. Okay, now what I want to show you is the indirect pathway, which is also going to be activated at the same time. Okay, now whilst the direct pathway is about activating the permissive signal to the specific portion of secondary motor cortex with the motor plan that needs to be initiated, okay, the indirect pathway is about making sure that you absolutely do not give permission to other areas of the secondary motor cortex, okay, which have junk motor plans that you don't want to initiate. Okay, so in the indirect pathway, you're going to upregulate the amount that you inhibit the permissive signals going to the other areas of secondary motor cortex. Okay, right, so I think in fact we'll have a break here, and in the next video we'll describe the indirect pathway.